Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We're excited to have this program tonight with Brian Earl. He's going to be talking about his podcast and book, Christmas Past. Um, Brian Earl is a designer, writer, and podcaster living in Silicon Valley. He's also one of those people who puts up the Christmas tree on Halloween and takes it down on Valentine's Day. Brian has performed a version of the podcast as a live show in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. He was a speaker at Christmas Con, Christmas Movie Fan Conference in 2019, and also at Podcast Movement, the podcasting industry's largest conference in 2018. He is a frequent guest on many popular Christmas-themed podcasts and other podcasts. And his podcast, Christmas Past, has over 2 million, a worldwide audience, 2 million downloads, and hundreds of five-star reviews. And we'll get to his presentation.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Here we are. It's Solstice Eve, or I guess Christmas Eve, something like that. But it is, one of the most bustling and busy times of the year. And here you are spending some of that precious remaining time in the Christmas season with me. And that means a lot to me. So I hope that this will be enjoyable for you. I hope we'll all have a good time here. And yeah, it is one of the most busy times of the year. I don't know if anyone can see me. Can't really quite see what you guys are seeing, but I'm not even at home. I'm at my little mountain getaway retreat in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This is where I come when I need a little nature and solitude and quiet time, which right around now I need. It's been a really busy time for me. I am the dad to a 3-year-old son. I have a very busy full-time job. Like Jeff just mentioned, I'm a designer at a big tech company out here. And right now is just my busy period for the Christmas season. This is the 8th season of Christmas Past, and I'll get into a bit more about that later on. But I put out episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we're finally winding down. This is the last full week of episodes. There will be one more that comes out on Friday, and then we're going to go right into the Christmas Day episode that comes out on Christmas Day on Monday, and that'll be it for the season. And then we kind of reset the clock. But this is a version of a talk that I've been giving for about a year now, where we talk generally about the book and the podcast. They're largely the same thing, just two different media for expressing the same ideas. And it's all about the fascinating stories behind our favorite holidays traditions. Let me see if I can change my slides here without making too much of a mess of things. Let's see. There we go. So all of it starts with a basic premise. This is sort of what I do with my work is digging into the idea that Christmas is not only the most wonderful time of the year, even though it most certainly is that, but it's more than that. It's also the most fascinating. There's really no other cultural phenomenon where we change so much about the world and ourselves for a period of time. And that period of time, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, is getting longer and longer. Now it's basically 2 months out of the year, shortly after Halloween and all the way through the end of the year. We change things like how the world looks and smells and sounds. You can't walk into a store without hearing Christmas music or turn on the radio. We change how we dress. We have Christmas clothes. We have clothes that we wear to Christmas parties. We have ugly sweaters, and we'll talk a bit more about that too. We change the kinds of foods we eat. All of a sudden there's mince pies and eggnog, and then all of a sudden there isn't again once the Christmas season goes away. But we also just change fundamental things about ourselves, our attitudes, how generous we become, how firmly committed we are to this idea of brotherly love and all of that kind of thing, familial love. We tend to long to see our families around this time of year. And we also even change how we talk. Well, words like humbug and tis and twas and merry. I mean, think about that. When else do you use the word merry? Unless you're talking about a merry-go-round or saying the phrase, the more the merrier. The word merry seems to exist and stay in the English language just so we can trot it out once a year to wish each other the greetings of the season. And for every one of the Christmas traditions we celebrate, there's a story. There's a reason we do it. We didn't just start putting up the Christmas tree and kissing under the mistletoe just 'cause. Every single one of those traditions that we celebrate has some origin story to it. And almost always, it's a story that either you don't know or you don't know as well as you think you do. There's also an element of the Christmas season that's kind of fossilized. And what I mean by that is there are things that remain part of the Christmas season more like in mention rather than in practice. We every year around Christmas we talk about sugar plums. You've never seen a sugar plum. I'll guarantee you that. You've never seen one and you've never tasted one. They're not around anymore, except that they kind of are. We talk about them during the Christmas season. Same thing goes for hot buttered rum, figgy pudding. Well, in America anyway, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on too. So let's see. Before I move on, I think it probably makes sense for me to take a little step back and say, well, why am I giving this talk? And Jeff talked about that a little bit, but I think it's probably worth expanding on a tiny bit. Go to my next slide. Oops, did I mean to do that? Yeah. So what happened was back in 2015, I was listening to a lot of podcasts like Planet Money and Hidden Brain and things like Radio Lab. These are ones that NPR and PRX put out. And there's a particular brand of storytelling that they use where they'll take fairly mundane topics, things about like taxes or the story behind why, something is called something. But the way that it's done with a certain narrative style and storytelling style and a mixture of narrative and music and interviews, all packages it up and turns it into something that you feel like you're being taken on a journey. You feel like you're being informed and entertained at the same time. And I said to myself, hey, I wonder if anything like that exists, but for Christmas. Is there Freakonomics for Christmas? Now, I had no notions at the time that I would start a podcast. The journey was not that I wanted to have a podcast about Christmas. It's that I went looking for a particular podcast about Christmas. And the bad news for me was that in 2015, there were no podcasts about Christmas. There were, but there were like two or three, one of which was a church that put out its Christmas sermons as a podcast feed. There were a couple that were podcasts of Christmas music, essentially just like a DJ playlist of different kinds of Christmas music, and a couple other really small ones here and there, but nothing at all like what I was looking for. And that's how all of this began. I said, well, I can't be the only one who would be interested in something like this. And since no one else is doing it, I guess I'm going to give it a try. And the crazy thing about all that was that I had no business doing anything like that. I'm not an academic or an historian. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a writer. I'm just someone who loves Christmas and figured I'd give it a go. But sorry, I'm going to turn my page. And yeah, I mean, what I did have going for me at a minimum was that I had a very clear idea of exactly what I wanted this thing to sound like and what I wanted people to feel like when they listened to it. It's a tough mix to try to get something that feels fascinating and informative and engaging and feels like you're listening to a story, but also keeping in mind why would someone be listening to a podcast like this? Well, because it's the Christmas season and they kind of want to get their Christmas feels on. So to get all of that into one little package was a pretty tough undertaking. And the trick for me was to find people who are absolute subject matters in their fields and based on interviews with them, turn their expertise into that final product. Because again, I'm not an historian or academic. I'm just someone who's going to use some basic storytelling skills to deliver on that promise. And what I'm going to try to do, and Jeff, you'll have to tell me if you can hear what I'm going to do here. I want to play a 2-minute intro to one of my episodes, just so you all can get a sense of the kind of work that I do, and then we'll go on from there. So hang on one second. Let's, fingers crossed, hope this works.
Yep, I can hear it.
Cool.
I've always loved those stories about famous products that were invented by accident. Maybe you've heard the one about the naval engineer who was working with tension springs, and when he dropped one on the floor, he noticed that it almost looked like it was crawling. And the next thing you know, the Slinky top-selling toys on the market. Or how about the company that was trying to make a super strong adhesive, but when they failed, they sold the result anyway, as Post-it notes. Well, here's one that maybe you haven't heard. It's about two brothers who ran a stationery store in Kansas City. The year was 1917, and like most retailers at the time, they offered customers plain tissue paper to use as wrapping paper. Only back then, it was referred to as gift dressings, which is kind of awesome and really needs to make a comeback. But one day, during the Christmas season, they ran out of gift dressings, so Raleigh, one of the brothers, went back to the warehouse to look for something, anything they could use instead. He found a stack of fancy, brightly colored paper sheets They planned on using them as the inner linings of their fancy envelopes. So he brought some of it back to the store, priced the sheets at 10 cents a pop, and the stuff just flew off the shelves. They couldn't keep up with demand. And just like that, a whole new industry was born. The wrapping paper we know and love today, with its bright colors and printed patterns, can trace its beginnings back to that one day, that one decision made in 1917 by a man named Raleigh Hall, who along with his brother J.C. ran a company that's still around today. Maybe you've heard of it. Hallmark. But what's maybe even more interesting is the fact that when all of this happened, the idea of wrapping gifts for Christmas was only about 50 years old. It seems unimaginable that there was ever a time when gifts wouldn't be wrapped. Think of the anticipation created by the concealment of gift wrap, or the beauty of a decoratively wrapped gift, the excitement of unwrapping to reveal the surprise of what's inside. All of that is relatively new. And there's an interesting story behind it, one that has to do with the influence of media, the rise of industrialization, and the birth of consumer culture. I'm Brian Earl. This is Christmas Past.
So that should give you an idea. That's my vibe. I do that. I take a Christmas tradition, go on a nerdy deep dive, and try to find all of these little surprising facts and hidden connections and things that you wouldn't think were related, or things that used to be part of the tradition and no longer are, and turn it into what it sounds like a fun, or what I hope to be a fun and interesting story that also feels Christmassy. And all of these episodes tend to be about 10, 15 minutes long, so it's not too much a commitment of your time. And again, all of that started in 2016. And I thought this would be a little hobby that I would do once a year around Christmas. I put out a dozen episodes. If anyone here has a podcast or knows someone who does, building an audience is hard. Now imagine trying to build an audience when people only care about your podcast for like 5 weeks out of the year. That's really hard. And so I wasn't prepared for what happened next. That the audience continued to grow and grow. Thanks largely to word of mouth, but also the show appearing in Time Magazine, Vanity Fair, the USA Today, the Financial Times, People Magazine, just, on and on and on, getting a lot of attention because they all want to put out these little, listicles around the holiday season for, hey, fun things you could listen to. But then eventually they started turning to me as a source of information. If someone needed a quote from a Christmas expert, I would start getting calls from reporters. And eventually got to the point where the audience had grown enough that I felt comfortable going to publishers and saying, hey, I have an audience here and I have this body of work behind me that I think we can put into another medium in the form of a book. And so that happened last year. The hardcover came out, Recorded Books also bought the license to the book and hired me to narrate the audiobook. And then just this year, that's the picture over to the right is me looking silly there on the History Channel's The Toys That Built America. They did an episode this season, episode 8 from season 3 of the Santa That America Built, where they had me on as a commentator. So throughout the podcast, throughout the work that I've done over these last 8 seasons now, there are 2 themes that just come up again and again and again. And they're basically the same theme. They're just different ways of saying the same idea. And that's where I want to focus the rest of our time together. Here is the first one. Christmas is constantly evolving. Remember I said, for every one of these traditions that we celebrate, we kiss under the mistletoe and we put up a tree, that there's a story behind all of that. And so we could think of Christmas as we recognize it today as kind of the sum total of all of those stories. And you might think of it as this curated collection of Christmas traditions that come from different times in history and different parts of the world, but it is not even close to the entire collection of Christmas traditions that ever were. We're looking at a picture right now of these people carrying a severed boar's head. There's even that song, The Boar's Head Carol. Remember again how I said before that we have things that stay in the Christmas season because we sing about them. We sing about the 12 days of Christmas, even though we don't really practice the 12 days of Christmas anymore. We sing about the Boar's Head Carol, even though I don't think anyone here it probably intends to eat boar's head for their Christmas dinner, but that was once common among the very wealthy. So Christmas is always, always evolving to the point where you could legitimately say you can't really celebrate the same Christmas twice. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? We can think about Christmas evolving in general ways. Like, for example, so much of your experience of Christmas really depends on a lot of modern technology. And that's really obvious when you think of all the Christmas lights that you see, but even more mundane things like modern transportation technology and food preservation and things being manufactured in factories and shipped long distances. All of that kind of stuff was a revelation when it came along in the 1900s, when widespread rail travel became popular. And what those kinds of things did to Christmas is not only made things more convenient, but more possible, but, and we'll go into this a little bit more later, really rebranded Christmas. Once widespread rail travel were possible and affordable for most people, Christmas became a holiday that was all about homecomings and family reunions, where it really wasn't before, because let's think about it, it couldn't have been. If you couldn't travel to see your family, then there really wouldn't be an element of like homecomings and family gatherings for Christmas. So we see a lot of how, as we evolve, Christmas evolves too. And that's my response whenever anyone says, oh, Christmas is becoming so commercial nowadays. I always say, well, sure, we're becoming more commercial. It would be more surprising if Christmas weren't becoming more commercial. It's really just a reflection of us. And some of this evolution is stuff that we can be grateful for. Let me go to my next slide. Because remember, I said that we have this curated collection of Christmas traditions, and that it's not the complete collection. Well, there are lots of traditions that came and went, either that they died out completely or that they never really made it over here to America. There is an old Welsh tradition called holly thrashing, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is something that young boys on Christmas morning would go around with branches of holly. If you've ever seen a holly branch, you would know why you don't want to be on the hitting end of one of those. They're very spiky leaves that can actually draw blood. But that was something that would be pretty common on Christmas Day, as boys running through the streets and whacking people with holly, or families with the last person that wakes up in the morning, they would whack them with holly, and that person would have to be kind of like the servant for the day. There was a tradition, I believe, mostly in Ireland, called the Wren Boys. There was a wren hunt, wren being W-R-E-N, the bird. And the Wren Boys would walk around with a dead bird on a stick, going door to door, singing. It was kind of a version of caroling. But the Christmases of long, long ago were populated with all kinds of monsters and superstitions and gross foods, and Santa, who was a lot more like a disciplinarian. And the interesting thing about all of this is that if Christmas is constantly evolving, that there must be some traditions now that are destined to die out, or ones that have died out within our lifetimes, or close to it. And that's why I have a picture of chestnuts here in this slide, because that is one tradition that died out right before our very eyes in the last several decades. You know, that song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, it is the opening line to that song because it was the quintessential Christmas image, especially in the Northeast of America, in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, where a lot of chestnuts grew. And then once you had the markets in New York City, you'd find them roasting, and those would be something that you would go and buy at the market and bring home to your family for Christmas time. Then all of a sudden, because of these imported chestnut trees from Asia, there was introduced to the entire Northeast a chestnut blight. And within a couple of years, I think like 5 years or so, all the chestnut trees died. And the chestnuts basically instantly stopped being part of American Christmas. And now they too became one of those things like sugar plums or figgy pudding or hot buttered rum that remain part of the Christmas season because we talk about them and sing about them, and maybe there's images of them somewhere, but we don't actually practice that. And of course, there are going to be exceptions to the rule. Someone's probably going to raise their hand and say, well, I like chestnuts. So do I. I mean, I bought some at the grocery store the other day. The point is, they are nowhere near the Christmas tradition that they once were. So remember I said there are two main points. Well, here's the second one. And like I said, it's kind of just the same point, just said differently. So if Christmas is constantly evolving, then Christmas as you and I know it is way newer than you probably realize, to the point where I feel comfortable saying that people from 5 generations ago would take a look at what we call Christmas and barely recognize it. Let's see, what do I want to say about that? Christmas in America wasn't even a national holiday until 1870. And even after that, it took a long time for it to become what we know it as today, where, basically the entire world celebrates Christmas. The entire world changes for about 2 months out of the year. Christmas, before it was a national holiday, it was really common for banks and schools to be open, and even into the early 20th century, even after President Grant declared it a federal holiday in 1870, it was still common for schools and banks and institutions to be open on Christmas Day into the early 20th century, believe it or not. And whereas Victorians had previously had the strongest cultural influence on Christmas, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, worldwide, they just really helped shape people's idea of what Christmas is and how we celebrate it. Currently, America is the one wielding the strongest cultural influence over that. That's been true since, I'd say about the 1920s. So about 100 years now. And it almost certainly will come to be one day that America no longer is wielding the most singular cultural influence over Christmas. We're just having our century, just as the Victorians had theirs in the last century. Let's see. I think a good place to focus is really when Christmas became the modern Christmas, the one that you and I recognize as Christmas. And we can point back to the Victorians around the middle of the 19th century into the turn of the 20th century, when a lot of things were happening at the same time and a lot of progress was made very quickly. I already talked about rail travel and how that really created whole new opportunities for Christmas. If you were living in the city, you could have farm fresh food brought in from the country, right? Those kind of things really weren't possible before that. There was a rising middle class with a lot more disposable income. There were increases in industrialization where we had more things being made in factories and shipped long distances. And we had this kind of rebranding from the high society of Victorian London, where they wanted to, quote unquote, domesticate Christmas. And what I mean by that is that prior to the Victorian influence, Christmas had, some historians use the phrase, had fallen into disrepair. It had become kind of a rowdy, raucous, street kind of holiday. You can generally think of holidays as being domestic or public, right? So a public holiday would be Halloween. You don't celebrate Halloween by having an intimate family gathering, right? Everyone goes out for Halloween. Same with, 4th of July, New Year's Eve to some extent. And Christmas used to be a bit more like that. It was the Victorians who really tried to rebrand Christmas as something that you celebrate in your home with your family. It was family centric. And again, the rail travel thing made a big influence on that, because now people moving away from the countryside to go get jobs in the city or go get jobs in factories, could now come home. And there were all kinds of, if you look at the literature around the Victorian period of Christmas, notwithstanding A Christmas Carol and notwithstanding all the ghost stories, and we can talk about that more if you like, there are many stories written about homecomings. Nowadays, right, the predominant Christmas story we tell is the romance. We put out dozens and dozens of these made-for-television romances every year about a new romance or a couple coming together during the Christmas season. And, we can look at what is going on in the culture now that makes that the one story that we want to tell over and over again. And we seem to want it told in a very particular way, where it's kind of conspicuously wholesome and something that you can watch with your whole family. But also another huge thing going on during the Victorian period was this explosion in print media. Now, why does that matter? Well, prior to that, if you didn't have a way of wielding influence far and wide, Christmas, if you celebrated it at all, you would celebrate it in a way that was very local, very specific to your region. We still have a lot of regional differences in Christmas here in America, but there were wide swaths of areas that wouldn't celebrate Christmas at all, or the way that they celebrated it would look very different from the way that someone 20 miles away might celebrate it. Where now all of a sudden we have this print media, and within, I think it was like a decade, the number of daily newspapers in America tripled. And there was a burgeoning print media in England at the time. And probably the most famous example of the media influencing the way that we celebrate Christmas was with, let's see, do I have a picture of it? Looking forward in my slides here. somewhere here. Well, anyway, it was Godey's Women's Magazine printed an image of Queen Victoria and her husband and children gathered around a Christmas tree. Now, the Christmas tree came from Germany. It came into England through German royalty marrying into the British family. The popular version of the story is that it was Prince Charles. It's not really true. It was Queen Charlotte. The problem was she was not a popular, that her family at the time, that was not a popular monarchy. But Queen Victoria was really popular. She was an influencer, and everything she did, everyone else wanted to do. And so it was, when was it? 1849, I want to say, that image was published. And then the next season, everyone had to have a Christmas tree. And when I mean everyone of means, because the point I made before about how a lot of the way that we celebrate Christmas really depends on mundane things like you don't really think about. But not everyone could have a Christmas tree if there weren't enough Christmas trees, right? Like these things have to be grown as a commercial crop in order for there to be enough for anyone who wants one to be able to buy one, to say nothing of the large artificial tree industry that would come along later on. So Christmas trees start to become more popular, but usually it's, if you lived on land where you can go cut one down, that would be one thing. But there weren't markets for these things until the early 20th century. We don't start seeing Christmas trees in American homes until around 1870. We're talking like post-Civil War period, but they weren't even especially common, again, until there were enough of them for everyone to buy. And it's not just a supply and demand. It's not just a supply problem. It's also the demand problem, right? These things need to be socialized. They kind of need to become a trend, like there need to be the early adopters, and then the trend grows over time. And so really it isn't until the early 20th century, we're talking like the 1910s, 1915s, that Christmas trees are like a proper thing here in America. And so that's why I said that someone from 4 or 5 generations ago would look at Christmas and barely recognize it. I'm in my late 40s now. So for me, maybe like my grandparents or my great grandparents would have been among the first American families to have Christmas trees in their homes. So we're not exactly talking about ancient history here. And it's the kind of thing that takes you aback when you stop to think about it, that Christmas is based on this 2,000-year-old religious story, and it's filled with carols from the 1600s and all these, images like candles and wreaths and holly and ivy and Christmas trees, things that seem like they must have, they're very earthy. They must have pre-Christian roots. They must be, ancient. And in a certain way they are, but not quite. They're ancient for small groups of people, but they're really common. The Christmas tree is very common to us only in the very most recent of times. And prior to the Christmas tree, by the way, the predominant greenery that you would have in your house would be things like holly and ivy and even rosemary. And so, if Christmas is constantly evolving, we can ask ourselves, will there come a day when the Christmas tree is no longer a thing or is no longer the thing it once was? Almost certainly that's true. Almost certainly in 200 years, there's going to be something else. And it's, I don't think we know what it is yet, but, it has constantly evolved up to this point and will continue to evolve after that. But then we can also think about how Christmas is newer than you might realize in like more obvious ways. Again, so much of the way that you experience Christmas depends on there being electricity. Widespread electrification in homes in America wasn't until the late 19th century, early 20th century. The Christmas light as we know it wasn't something that came along until, let me see, I had it written down here. 1882, those were invented, but they were really expensive. And only, I think it was 7 or 8 would come on a string. And it wasn't until, I think, 20 years later that they started showing up at Woolworths and department stores like that. As a little aside, that's another thing that really changed Christmas. Department store shopping, Woolworths and Wanamaker's really changed the way that we did retail shopping. Prior to that, a shop was something that you would go in, you talk to someone, they'd have some things behind the counter for you. It was a very curated experience. The idea of going into a store and taking merchandise off a shelf yourself and bringing it up to a cash register, that's a new thing. That's an American invention of the 20th century that changed the way we did any kind of shopping at all, and certainly influenced the way that we do Christmas shopping. But back to this idea of Christmas being new, it seems fairly obvious to think that, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and the Charlie Brown Christmas and White Christmas and all these Christmas movies, they're only decades old. I mean, I can't imagine Christmas without Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but my mom doesn't have to imagine it. She didn't grow up with it. It didn't come out until the 60s, and same with Charlie Brown. White Christmas, what ubiquitous, basically defines the sound of Christmas. My grandparents didn't grow up with that. That didn't come out until they were in their 20s. So a lot of these things, kind of come into Christmas as the decades go on. But here's one that's I think is probably going to surprise you a lot. It's a question. Are you older than Santa Claus? Well, if you know anything about the legend of Santa Claus, you know that there really was a guy named Nicholas of Myra. He was in the part of the world that's now Turkey. This was in the 300s. He was a bishop. He's recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church. There's very little record of his life, but there are some things that are known about him. There's one famous story, just as a quick aside, that he was very generous. And this is one of the things we probably do know about him, that his parents were very wealthy. They died in the plague. They left him a large inheritance that he had no use for, and he liked to give away his money. And that's part of how the legend of his generosity came about. And there's this one story about how he saved a family from poverty by throwing money down their chimney at night, and the coins would bounce and land in the stockings. And that's where the whole story about stockings and Santa Claus coming down the chimney came from. And it's a nice story, but the bummer is that there's no way it's possible. Houses didn't have chimneys until about 1,000 years after Nicholas died. I'm not saying he didn't actually help a family who was poor, but he certainly didn't throw the money down the chimney because the house couldn't have had a chimney back then. But anyway, so Nicholas of Myra then dies, obviously. And for a long time, many European cultures did, and still do, by the way, celebrate St. Nicholas Day on December 6th. And his legend was that of mostly a patron saint, not as a magical gift bringer, but as someone who would protect a ship. He was the patron saint of brewers and pawnbrokers and other things besides. And there were lots of legends of him, rescuing people and protecting people. Had no special connection to Christmas at all. That wasn't until the Protestant Reformation, where they wanted the Christkindl, the Christ child, to be the gift bringer who went around on Christmas Day, because Saint Nicholas as a saint was something they wanted to move away from venerating the saints. That was a Catholic idea. That was tantamount to idolatry to them. And so that idea didn't go over very well. And so Nicholas and the Christ child would go around together on Christmas Day. And then eventually it was just Saint Nicholas. And still, he's not Santa Claus at this point. He's still Saint Nicholas to bring in gifts. Later on, there is the Dutch legend of Sinterklaas, that's not just Dutch for Saint Nicholas. It's more that is a character based on Saint Nicholas, which eventually gets melded together with some ideas about Father Christmas in England. Again, Father Christmas is not just what they call Santa Claus over there. He was a separate character. They all kind of meld together, especially as we have all these immigrants coming into the northeast of America at around the same time. You have a lot of cultures mixing and matching, and we're kind of figuring out what Christmas is over here. Is really the time we start to coalesce around this notion of Santa Claus. And again, I was on that episode of the History Channel. Check it out. They really tell that story very, very well about how Santa Claus, as you and I know him, is a product of the American early 20th century. And it took a while for us to figure out what Santa Claus looks like and how he behaves and where he lives and what he does. And so we can look at some of these iterations here. So over to the left, we have this image of St. Nicholas. Here he's bringing the gifts, and you see he's got his bishop's robe and bishop's mitre hat, and he's carrying a staff. It looks sort of Santa Claus-ish, but there is some key differences. And then we look at the two sort of in the middle. The top one is from A Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem published by Clement Clarke Moore. Initially, it was published in a newspaper and anonymously, and there were no images. This is from a early Houghton Mifflin color edition, where you can see that he's not even tall enough to reach the mantle. And if you think about those words in the poem, he rides a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. He has a little round belly. He's a right jolly old elf. So even, in the late 19th century, when the poem was written, Santa Claus is seen as kind of elfin or gnome-like. He's magical. He's very much like the European folk tales of these elfin witch-like characters who, you come upon them in the woods and they ask you a riddle. And if you're good, they'll give you a reward. And if you're bad, they might play a trick on you. I think nowadays the one thing we would say about Santa is he might leave coal in your stocking, but there were all kinds of legends about how he and his scary helpers might play a trick on you to kind of keep you in line. This picture here, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, the one with the little Bo Peep. You can see he's shorter than an adult woman, so that would make him, the average of not even quite 5 feet tall. It's not until we get into the late 19th, early 20th century that we start to see a couple of very influential artists leaving their mark on Santa Claus. The one at the bottom here, this is Thomas Nast. He did a lot of illustrations for Harper's. This is probably one of his most famous, but he did many every year. And again, this is the combination of influential art and a burgeoning print media. Something like this can be published in a magazine and just get really broad coverage. I think it's, we live nowadays where something could just become a meme very quickly, spread across the world. But, we're talking about 19th century media being able to wield an influence through this kind of artwork. And then over here, we start to see two super, super influential artists. This top one here is J.C. Leyendecker, kind of the unsung hero of the shaping of the Santa Claus image. And this bottom one here is Norman Rockwell. And both of them drew lots and lots and lots of Santa Claus images for the Saturday Evening Post. But still, if sometimes if you look at some of these Leyendeckers, especially, he'll still have a bulbous red nose. You can kind of see that in this image. He still looks like he's kind of short. Sometimes he might have pointy ears. He's still not totally human sometimes, right? According to some artists, he's still like maybe a little magical, maybe a bit of a gnome or an elf. It wasn't until we get to the 1930s. This is the final one over here on the right. Probably the most influential artist on the image of Santa Claus, Haddon Sundblom. You've seen his work if you've ever eaten Quaker Oats or Aunt Jemima pancakes. You know his graphic design work. He was one of those guys who made characters for packaging. And in the early 1930s, Coca-Cola started commissioning him to do a Santa Claus painting, at least one every year, which he did for decades. And Coca-Cola, again, massive marketing budget, was able to take this image of Santa. And then we've taken out all of the elfin, witch-like, gnome-like kind of characteristics to him. He's a full-sized human adult who wears red. There's kind of a rumor that, Coca-Cola wanted to make his suit red to match their brand. I think it kind of worked out to their favor that their Santa had a red suit. I mean, again, you can look, Santa's been wearing red for a long, long time. So there's a grain of truth to that, but it's not quite to that level. But because they were able to just, plaster the world, with their advertisements, billboards, in-store displays, that's really the one that had the largest influence. And that's really, for all of the evolution throughout the centuries and millennia of St. Nicholas, we get to 1930 and we just kind of stop iterating on Santa. We all kind of agree now. This is who Santa is. This is what he looks like. And so back to my question, are you older than Santa Claus? Well, I mean, this is 90 years ago that the image of Santa, if the picture that comes into your head when you think about Santa Claus, is only about 90 years old. So there are people alive today older than this. There are people who, when they were born, this image of Santa, the Santa we all recognize, didn't exist yet. And that's really how much Christmas just keeps evolving, and will always continue to. I think we can skip over. This is one of the ones I talked about this a little bit before. The rumor how Coca-Cola really invented Santa Claus, and it's like, yeah, there's a little bit of truth to that, but not quite. Another one I hear all the time, people write to me all the time, is like, oh, you got to cover Christmas trees and how they're a pagan tradition. No, they're not. No, they are not. Not at all. Not even close. The story was that Saint Boniface was a missionary, and this was in the 700s, was going through Germany to convert the heathens or the pagans over to Christianity. And according to legend, and it's almost certainly 90% legend instead of factual, he came across this one tribe who was about to do a human sacrifice in front of an oak tree. And a lot of these cultures would have, they would kind of venerate a tree in their area. And there was one, the oak tree was often associated with the god Thor. It was called the Thunder Oak, and it was where you do all kinds of rituals, including ritual sacrifice. And Boniface, in the story, was able to stop a sacrifice in progress and then cut down the thunder oak, and standing behind it was a fir tree. And he said, look, you want to worship a tree? How about that one? That's the tree of the Christ child. And from then on, the fir tree became the symbol of Christ and Christmas. Yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. It really wasn't, again, until we get till much later, after the Protestant Reformation, where they wanted a neutral symbol of Christmas, one that wasn't like a saint or something like that to symbolize Christmas. But the Christmas tree itself is like, no way, it's absolutely not a pagan symbol. But venerating a tree or something like that, or having a tree symbolize something, does precede Christianity itself. That idea of trees being an important part of the culture and symbolizing the season is if you want to use the word pagan, I would just say pre-Christian tradition. And then we talked about how, it was, this is the image that was published in Godey's Women's Magazine, how it became very, very popular. And then in the the mid 1800s, we start to see Christmas trees appearing in America. Franklin Pierce was the first president to have a Christmas tree. Grover Cleveland was the first one to have Christmas lights on it. But again, it really wasn't until the early 19th century. This picture here on the right is circa 1910 of Christmas trees being brought from a farm into a city for everyone to have. So I always like to end this talk. Well, again, we can have questions and answers afterward, but the last of the prepared remarks is to kind of think about where we've taken a look at where we've been with Christmas, but let's take a look at where we are now and where we might be going. I think one of the first points I made was about how, look, we start celebrating Christmas in November and celebrate it for almost 2 months out of the year. That's new. That is very new. The Christmas season being the period between Thanksgiving and Christmas is really, again, a product of the early 20th century. And a lot of people will point to retailers wanting to extend the Christmas season, or extend the Christmas shopping season. Prior to all of this, the period leading up to Christmas was already spoken for. It's the Advent season. And if you're a religious person, it's not a time to eat candy canes and watch Hallmark movies. It's a time of fasting and prayerful preparation for Christmas Day, leading up to the vigil of the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, the 12th night, and then into the Epiphany, the celebration of the Epiphany itself. So the Advent season was the sort of the preparatory period, and then we would have this Christmas season that began on Christmas Day and lasted for 12 days. Again, the famous 12 days of Christmas that we sing about, but like we don't actually observe anymore. And for a long, long time, the Christmas season was between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Now we're starting to see it a little bit earlier. I think it's a little bit before Halloween is when the Hallmark Channel will start doing their countdown to Christmas. It's always been true that you see things on retail store shelves like around Halloween time. I've heard since I was a kid, it's coming earlier and earlier every year, and it can't possibly be true because we would have circled back on ourselves several times already. I think what is changing is just how much of it we're seeing, how early. But we're really getting to the point now where the Christmas season, we all observe it as this thing that lasts about 2 months out of the year. Basically, after Halloween, Thanksgiving is kind of something that happens in the ramp up to the Christmas season. But I think that's probably one of the biggest changes that we're making as a culture is we're kind of rewriting the rules on how long the Christmas season is. Also shopping. And that might sound like a pretty obvious thing, but in the last 20 years, how we've changed all of our shopping habits, and really the culture around that. When I was growing up, Christmas shopping was something you would make time for. You would get in the car, you'd go to the mall. And the whole culture around that has changed. We now have more time to watch all those 40 plus Hallmark movies that come out every year. But also, personally, I think we miss a little something. We miss the serendipity. We miss the social aspect of shopping. But also, you're going in to look for something and something else catches your eye. You don't really quite get that when you're just dealing with algorithms and clicking and just, things like that. I already talked about chestnuts, how that's a tradition that just in our lifetime, we've seen that die out. Will it come back? I don't think so. I think another big change that we're seeing within our lifetime is a culture divide around Christmas. There was a Pew Research study that came out a couple years ago that found that 1 out of 3 Americans really actually subscribes to this idea that there's some kind of war on Christmas, that some unseen force somewhere is trying to take Christmas away from you or something like that. I'm not going to tell you my position on that. It's just, I'm, as someone who observes these trends, that's really interesting that people seem to think that Christmas is under attack, and just really changes the dynamic, how we relate to one another at Christmas. You don't need to spend all that much time on the internet to see some of that stuff, rear its head. There was also another large study that came out a long time ago, I think it was 5 years ago, about the way that you celebrate Christmas now versus when you were a child, and things like Christmas caroling or going to church on Christmas has just really sharply declined across the board, right? On average, I'm not saying no one does it anymore, but just average, those things are going away. Christmas caroling for a long time had been something that sort of had its peak of popularity kind of, dwindled down to something that, I don't know, like, your Boy Scout troop might do at the old folks home. But now basically, you don't see it unless it's someone who's hired to come to an event to do some caroling. Going door to door and caroling when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't common, but you wouldn't raise an eyebrow to it. I think nowadays, if someone knocked on your door to sing Christmas carols, you might not want to answer the door. And I think some of the trends that we're seeing now are only that. They're just trends. Number one would be like the ugly Christmas sweater. That's something that's been around since the 2010s. Very much in the same way that the aluminum Christmas tree was a trend in the 60s that came and went. There are other trends like that. I think the ugly sweater, I think we've reached the peak in the last couple of years. I think, they're going to kind of fade out. And in a few years, we'll look back and like, oh yeah, remember the ugly Christmas sweater? That was a thing. One that I'm not quite sure about yet is the elf on the shelf. And it's interesting to call that a Christmas tradition because, you're dealing with like one company's product. But at the same time, listening to White Christmas and watching Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, all of that stuff is you're interacting with some company's intellectual property, like you're consuming a brand at the same time that you're practicing a Christmas tradition. And the reason I think the elf on the shelf is a little iffy is because if we're being pedantic about it, by the way, a tradition by definition is something that's handed down from one generation to another. So, it needs to last at least one generation for it to be a proper tradition. And the elf on the shelf is long enough now that there might be some young parents, I mean, very young parents who grew up with it and are now doing it for their kids. And its popularity doesn't seem to be dwindling. There's a whole line of marketing around it and media and stage shows and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see if that too is something that's just going to kind of come and go, or if that's really here to stay. Personally, as the dad to a 3-year-old, you're never going to see one of those in my house. I don't like those. I don't like the ugly sweater. As someone who studies these things, I find them interesting in their own way. It's fun to look at how something like that could come to be, and just what it says about us. But I don't necessarily have to like and participate in those things. And likewise for just the crazy decorations for the houses. The BBC put out an article this week looking at how this is, mostly an American phenomenon, just, decorating your house to the hilt and hiring a company to decorate your house for you so that you can be the fanciest one on the block. And there are some people spending well over 6 figures, in total over the course of several seasons to really get their display to be, what they want it to be. When I was growing up, there might have been 1 or 2 houses that really went all out, and that too seems to be becoming the norm. Just this crazy, crazy ostentatious having, displays outside your house that are timed with music, and you put on like a light show. Have 100 inflatables in your yard. People often ask me when they know that I have a Christmas podcast if I'm like, they say, oh, your house must have 1,000 of those inflatables. And no, again, I find them interesting, but I don't necessarily find them appealing. They're just not my personal taste. So I think we're at the end of what I had prepared for a discussion. I kind of wanted to take a look back at Christmas and kind of think about where we are now. What are some of the things we've seen change, and where are the kinds of things that we might be changing right now that we won't really kind of know until we've actually made those changes and can look back on it. But we have some time remaining. And Jeff, I don't know how you want to do this. People can put a question in the chat, or if you want to moderate, or something like that. If anyone has any questions, comments, Christmas memories, anything like that, I'd be delighted um, to field some discussion. And what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing my screen. I don't know if that means you can see me better now, but here I am. But let's see, am I seeing some things in the chat? Christmas again evolve in 10 to 20 years from now. So yes, I mean, yes, I think for all the reasons I just mentioned. And one thing I didn't mention is this notion of telepresence as something that is part of Christmas. So again, technology really changes how we connect around Christmas. When the universal penny post came out in England, this happened right around the time where the postage stamp was introduced. For a uniform rate, you could send a piece of mail anywhere in the country. This was also around the time that lithography, a printing technique, became very popular. And so someone said, okay, look, I'm going to invent the Christmas card. That was a man named Cole, Henry Cole, and he hired an artist named John Horsley to produce this famous first Christmas card. But so, those couple of things happening at the same time: printing technology, increased income, rising literacy rates, and a uniform postal rate, all converging around the same time. And now all of a sudden, you can communicate long distances over Christmas. And then along comes rail travel. Now you can travel and see people around Christmas time. And then the telephone comes along, and you can call people. You can call someone on the other side of the country on Christmas. And for every one of those, there goes through this period where people say, well, isn't that a little impersonal? Isn't it like calling on the phone? It's not quite as good as the real thing. And I think we all experienced that within the last few years, where technology like this, like Zoom, like Skype, is about 20 years old. But it wasn't until the pandemic where we didn't really have any choice but to get together by telepresence. And so I think there's still a reluctance of a lot of people, like, I'm going to Zoom my grandmother on Christmas. Gosh, that seems a little sterile. But at the same time, I think that the pandemic was kind of a tipping point that made us find that a little bit more acceptable, or more people than would have otherwise done it started doing it. Let's see. What is the best podcast episode of yours to start? No, I don't know. Any one of them. Any of the one that's where the title says backstory at the beginning of it. Because I have other episodes that are kind of like more, roundtable discussions, or some that are, they're just a different style. But the kind that are like the one I described, where I'm kind of like doing an NPR kind of vibe, those all have the word backstory at the beginning. And so backstory hyphen and then the name of the tradition that I'm talking about. Let's see. Christmas markets are going to become widespread in the U.S. I don't know. I think that really depends. We sort of do a version of one where I live in California, in the Bay Area. It's not at all like a German market, and you stand in line for 2 hours to get a pretzel. But Christmas markets, are like a huge thing in Germany. We don't quite see them the same way here in America. And actually, just kind of on that point, I said that for a long time, England was wielding the strongest cultural influence on Christmas. And a lot of that came over here to America with us. But a lot of it, for some reason, and this is something I try to understand myself, a lot of it didn't. Figgy pudding, for example. The song "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." We tend to sing the first verse. There are 4 verses to that song, and the remaining 3 after the first are all about figgy pudding. It's all like, bring us some, we won't leave until we get some, we love it, blah, blah, blah. And for most Americans, it's something that's part of the season just because we sing about it. We don't actually make it. I'm not saying no one does, because I make a figgy pudding every year. And it's fun. Like, you can light it on fire with brandy, and it just kind of tastes like brown bread or fruitcake or something like that. But it's just not really part of the way that most of us celebrate. Other British traditions, like the Christmas cracker, that thing you pull apart that has little prizes in it, you see them here and there, but they're really part of the British Christmas. Or mince pies. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there now, in Germany, in England, in Spain, in France, that are just not. Italy, they have the whole other gift bringer, La Befana, that just really aren't part of our Christmas celebration. But they could be. If you want to just dig into Christmas traditions and try to find some things that you might want to add to your own Christmas. for me, the way that I always do that is through food. So I make my own mince pies every year. I make figgy pudding. I made this year a traditional Irish fruit cake. That's another thing that we don't do. The traditional Christmas cake that you layer with marzipan and then fondant icing. And it's this cake that you make in October and you feed it whiskey every 2 weeks to mature the flavors. If you're inclined to do that kind of thing, I highly recommend looking into it because it makes the season a lot more fun. And, you can just kind of celebrate it more. Yeah. Let's see. Someone's talking about Boxing Day, and that is actually the final episode that I'm doing for this season. It'll come out on Friday, where I talk about Boxing Day. So Boxing Day, if you don't know, it's the day after Christmas. Roughly, it coincides with St. Stephen's Day. He's the martyred saint. They're not the same day, but they coincide. And very often in England, the way that the day works now, it's not necessarily December 26th. It's kind of like how American Thanksgiving is always the third Thursday of the month. So a couple of years ago, Boxing Day actually was not on December 26th, and they even got more of a holiday. But it's an actual holiday in England. The banks are closed, schools closed. And it's kind of befuddling why we don't do it here in America. We basically do the day after Thanksgiving, that Friday, we take as a de facto holiday. And the way that the Brits celebrate Boxing Day is really largely the same. It's like you eat leftovers, you watch a lot of sports, you might go do some shopping, that kind of thing. But yeah, Boxing Day is just something, it's not a real holiday here, even though it totally is in England. And I don't know why it wouldn't. I'm not working on the 26th, but that's just me. Let's see. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, I was just gonna say about the older traditions coming back or migrating. Like I know that a lot of those like holiday monsters are like
Yeah.
migrating over here, like Krampus in recent years. So I just was wondering if you had a comment about that trend.
Yeah. So I mean, like nowadays, prior to widespread media, the internet, something like that, like these things tend to be a lot more organic. Nowadays, almost anything that comes back into the public consciousness is almost certainly profit driven. Someone's making a movie. There was a 2015 movie about Krampus. But then also, the internet and social media has just really made it easy for things to get shared around and for people to find community around them. There is one major city in America, and I'm forgetting which one it was, that actually has a Krampus festival. But yeah, I mean, Christmas used to have a lot more monsters in it. It used to be a lot more spooky. It used to share a lot in common with Halloween. And you have to think, like, Christmas is a midwinter celebration. And it's one of many, right? There a lot of cultures had a midwinter celebration. This was a time after the harvest. A lot of your work is done. You couldn't do any more work because the ground is frozen. You'd have to kill off a lot of your herd because you couldn't grow anything to feed them. So all of a sudden you have all this food. The days are getting shorter. You have a good reason to huddle together and strengthen social ties and really just hunker down through the winter. And so that's what, those kinds of cultures that were based around agriculture have always had some kind of midwinter festival like this. It was also the time of year where you'd finish up your wine and beer making. So, put it all together and you're going to have some kind of festival. But it was also a time of year where, like, almost certainly someone you knew was going to die before the winter was over, right? Like guaranteed. And maybe even you yourself would die. That was very, very common when there was no heating or anything like that. And so there were a lot of legends that grew out of those fears, like the bleak midwinter was really a time that you had to be really careful. And there were a lot of things lurking that you couldn't see in the darkness. And so a lot of those, Krampus and the Mari Lode, which is a Welsh tradition of the gray mare, the ghostly horse. And I did an episode about that this season. There is Belsnickel and Parafuatard and you mentioned Krampus and Zwart Piet, all of these little characters, these kind of like, gnome-like, and even elves, for example. Before they became these little jolly worker bees who live in the North Pole, I mean, elves were kind of mischievous. They could curse you, they could kidnap you, and I did a nice episode about that this season too. If you want to know more about elves, like how did they go from being these European folklore characters to being people who live at the North Pole with Santa Claus and just like mass-produced toys for him. That took a while to get from point A to point B, but yeah, I think a lot of people now, there's kind of a hunger for maybe a bit more of the gritty side of Christmas, we all grew up with Christmas being this entirely benign, sterile, sickly sweet kind of holiday where it's all just comfy, cozy, and huggy and squishy and family and gifts but it wasn't always that way. There was a lot more to it, that not only with the monsters, but I mentioned before the kind of like publicness of the holiday. It was something that you'd celebrate out in the streets, in the bars. You would, roam through the streets making noise. That's part of the reason the Victorians wanted to domesticate it, was because it was basically getting unruly and largely associated with kind of like the lower classes. The class divide was a lot more stark back then. But yeah, it tended to be just seen as kind of a, like trashy kind of thing. And then it was really from that period on where increasingly over the decades following from the mid 19th century, Christmas became a lot more just sterile. And I think where the pendulum's starting to swing a little bit. I don't think it's swinging a lot, honestly. I think it's still like if you like Krampus or Belsnickel or anything like that, you're kind of on the fringes. But I understand it. I get the appeal.
I don't think I see any more questions in the chat. Um, so if there's no more questions, just want to say thank you to Brian Earl. Please check out his book and podcast. And please check out, we have an event, holiday concert this Friday at 3 p.m. at the main branch. So if you could, so please check that out. And thanks again, everybody, for joining. And have a great Christmas. Have a great holiday season. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone. Merry Christmas. Thanks for coming.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.